I'm going to show you a little slideshow presentation that I put together years ago, and you're going to understand why I haven't updated it for recent presidential elections. I think I did this back in 2004, so the names that you're going to see here are not current names, and whether you recognize them or not, I don't know how many names you know that you have in your data bank, right? But I focused on the Democratic Party process in 2004 because, you know, just like a moment ago, I told you in 2012 all the action was on the Republican side because there was a Democratic incumbent president. Barack Obama was running for re-election. In a very similar way, in 2004, all of the action was on the Democratic side because the Republican president, George W. Bush, was running for re-election. So it was a foregone conclusion that the Republicans were going to renominate George W. Bush. So when I put this together, that's where the action was, and so I focused on the Democratic names. Okay? So here's the starting point. Here's what the kind of the way you want to think about this. Each state has a certain number of delegates to the party's national convention. Okay? And this is what it looked like in 2004 in the Democratic Party. California had the most delegates, 440. Okay? Why do you think California had the most delegates? What's this
population.
Population. To a large extent, it's based on population. There are some other pieces of the formula that go in. For example, if California has the most delegates to the Democratic National Convention because it has the most population, which state should have had the second most?
Texas.
Texas should have had the second most, but in fact, it was New York. And the reason that New York had more delegates than Texas is the population of Texas is larger than the population of New York, but the part of that's a big part of the formula, but it's not all of the formula. Another piece of the formula has to do with how many votes the Democratic ticket got in the previous election. And since New York, the Democratic ticket typically gets much more vote than the Democratic ticket does in Texas, that gave New York more delegates to the Democratic National Convention. So it can be complicated. Okay? We said at the very beginning it can be complicated. Okay? All right, so let's throw the rest of the states out there, and you can pick your favorite one to see how many delegates they had to the Democratic National Convention in 2004. Okay? All right. That number 232, let's focus on that one. That's how many delegates Texas had. Let's see how that works. Now, in Texas, you know, I said that it differs from one state to another. Texas is a good illustration because in Texas, the Democrats use a process that is different than the Republicans. Okay? In the Republican Party in Texas, 100% of the delegates, all of the delegates, this is the Republican Party, all of the delegates from Texas to the Republican National Convention are selected by the primary voting process. So Republican voters go into the voting booths around the state. They cast their ballot for their preferred Republican candidate. The votes are counted at the end of the day, and based on the breakdown of the vote, or based on the tabulation of the vote, you know, that's how they determine the delegates. And the Republicans use, in most states, including Texas, they use a winner-take-all arrangement. Okay? What does that suggest?
They get the majority, they get all the...
Let's say you have 3 candidates on the ballot seeking the Republican nomination in Texas. And by the way, all of the names may not be on the ballot. Okay? Remember, this process is run by the states, and so candidates have to conform to state requirements. Candidates may get on the ballot in some states, and they may not get on the ballot in other states. At any rate, let's just say for our argument, or for our illustration, that there are 3 Republicans on the ballot in the Republican primary in Texas. And the votes are cast. Republicans go into their voting booths on primary day and they cast their ballot. And here's the way that it turns out. Candidate A gets 45, candidate B gets 40% of the vote, and candidate C gets 15% of the vote. Okay? What is a winner take all? And let's just say, I don't know what the actual number is, but let's say that there are 100 delegates from Texas, just to keep the numbers simple. There are 100 delegates from Texas to the Republican National Convention. What does this suggest?
The one with the
They
highest
get all
amount of votes
100.
won.
He gets all of the delegates. Or she gets all of those delegates, right? So all of those delegates from Texas, when they go to convention later in the summer, they're all pledged to candidate A.